Morning. Page 78, Chapter 4. Why did we stand for it? Among my readers, there is a certain educated Marxist historian sitting in his soft armchair and leafing through this book to the passage about how we built the disciplinary barracks. He takes off his glasses, taps the page with something flat, a ruler perhaps, and nods his head repeatedly. Yes, this bit I can believe, but all the stuff about the whiff of revolution, I'll be damned if I do. You could not have a revolution, because revolutions take place in accordance with the laws of history. In your case, all that happened was that a few thousand so-called politicals were picked up and did what? Deprived a human appearance of dignity, deprived of human appearance of dignity, family, freedom, clothing, food. What did you do? Why didn't you revolt? We were earning our rations. I told you, building a prison. That's fine. Just what you should have been doing. It was for the good of the people. It was the only correct solution. But don't call yourselves revolutionaries, my friends. To make a revolution, you must be linked with the one and only progressive class. Yes, but weren't we all workers by then? That is neither here nor there. That is a Philistine quibble. Have you any idea what historical necessity means? I rather think I have. I honestly have. I have an idea that when camps with millions of prisoners exist for 40 years, that's where we can see historical necessity at work. So many millions for so many years cannot be explained by Stalin's vagaries or various perfidy, by the naive trustfulness of the ruling party, or which the light of the vanguard doctrine never ceased to shine. But I won't cast this example of historical necessity in my opponent's teeth. He would only smile sweetly and tell me that this was not the subject under discussion, that I was straying from the point. He sees that I am at a loss, and I have no clear conception of historical necessity, and explains. Those were revolutionaries who rose up and swept Tsarism away with their broom. Very simple. If Tsar Nicky had so much as tried to squeeze his revolutionaries so hard, if he had just tried to pin numbers on them, if he had even tried. You are right, he didn't try. He didn't try, and that's the only reason why they survived to try it when he had gone. But he couldn't try it, he couldn't. Probably also correct. Not that he might not have liked to, but that he couldn't. In the conventional cadet, let alone socialist interpretation, the whole of Russian history is a succession of tyranny. The Tatar tyranny, the tyranny of the Moscow princes, 5 centuries of indigenous tyranny on the Oriental model, and of social order firmly and frankly rooted in slavery. Forget about the assemblies of the land, the village commune, the free Cossacks, the free peasantry of the north. Whether it was Ivan the Terrible, Alexis the Gentle, heavy-handed Peter, or velvety Catherine, all the Tsars right up to the Crimean War knew one thing only: how to crush their subjects like beetles or caterpillars. If a man was sentenced to hard labor and deportation, they pricked on his body the letters S.K. and chained him to his wheelbarrow. The state bore hard on its subjects. It was unflinchingly firm. Mutinies and uprisings were invariably crushed. Only crushed, yes, but the word needs qualification. Not crushed in our modern technical sense. After the war with Napoleon, when our army came back from Europe, the first breath of freedom passed over Russian society. Faint as it was, the Tsar had to reckon with it. The common soldiers, for instance, who took part in the Decembrist rising, which was a single one of them strung up, was a single one shot, and in our day would a single one of them have been left alive? Neither Pushkin nor Lermontov. could be simply put inside for a tenor. Roundabout ways of dealing with them had to be found. Where would you have been in St. Petersburg? Where would you have been in Petersburg on December 14th? Nicholas asked. I asked Pushkin. Pushkin answered honestly, on the Senate Square, and by way of punishment he was told to go home, whereas all of us, who had left on our own hides the workings of a mechanized judicial system, and of course all our friends in public prosecutors' offices, know the proper price for Pushkin's answer. Article 58, Section 2, armed insurrection, or the mildest possible treatment, Article 19, criminal intent, and if not shooting, certainly nothing short of a tenor. Our Pushkins had heavy sentences slapped on them, went to the camps and died. Gumilev never even got as far as camp, settled accounts with him in a cellar. Of all her wars, the Crimea was Russia's luckiest. It brought the emancipation of the peasants and Alexander's reform, and what is more, the greatest of social forces, public opinion, appeared simultaneously in Russia. On the face of it, the Siberian katorga went on festering and even spread. More transit prisons were brought into operation. Prisoners were still transported in droves. Courts were always in session. But what is this? The courts were in session, but Vera Zasulich, who shot at the chief of police in the capital, was acquitted. 7 attempts were made on the life of Alexander II himself. Karakazov, Solovyev's, and 1 year Alexandrovsk. One outside Kursk, Kalchurin's explosion, Teterka's mine, Grinovitsky. Alexander II went around Petersburg with fear in his eyes, but incidentally without a bodyguard, like a hunted animal. According to Tolstoy, who met the Tsar on the staircase of a private house. What did he do about it? Ruin and banish half Petersburg, as happened after Kirillov's murder? You know very well that such a thing could never enter his head. Did he apply all the methods of prophylactic mass terror? Total terror, as in 1918? Take hostages? The concept didn't exist. Imprison dubious persons? It simply wasn't possible. Execute thousands? They executed 5. Fewer than 300 were convicted in the courts in this period. If just one such attempt had been made on Stalin, how many million lives would it have cost us? The Bolshevik Alminsky writes that in 1891 he was the only political prisoner in the whole crusty prison. Transferred to Moscow, he was the only one in the Taganka. It was only in the Butyrki. It was awaiting deportation that a small party of them was assembled. With every year of education and literary freedom, the invisible but terrible power of public opinion grew, until the Tsars lost their grip on both reins and mane, and Nicholas II could only clutch at crupper and tail. It is true that the inertial undertow of dynastic tradition prevented him from understanding the demands of his age, and that he lacked the courage to act. In the age of airplanes and electricity, he still lacked all social awareness, and thought of Russia as his own rich and richly variegated estate, in which to levy tribute, breed stallions, and raise armies for a bit of war now and again, with its imperial brother of the House of Hohenzollern. But neither he nor any of those who governed him, who governed for him any longer had the will to fight for their power. They no longer crushed their enemy. They merely squeezed them gently and let go. They were forever looking over their shoulders and straining their ears. What would public opinion say? They persecuted revolutionaries just sufficiently to broaden their circle of acquaintance with prisons, in prisons, toughen them, and ring their heads with halos. We now have an accurate yardstick to establish the scale of these phenomena, and we can safely say that the Tsarist government did not persecute revolutionaries, but tenderly nurtured them for its own destruction. The uncertainty, half-heartedness, and feebleness of the Tsar government are obvious to all who have experienced an infallible judicial system. Let us examine, for instance, some generally known biographical facts about Lenin. In spring 1887, his brother was executed for an attempt on the life of Alexander III. Like Karakazov's brother, Lenin was the brother of a would-be regicide. And what? And what happened to him? In the autumn of that very year, Vladimir Ulyanov was admitted to the Imperial University in Kazan, and what is more, to the law faculty. Surprising, isn't it? True, Vladimir Ulyanov was expelled from the university in the same academic year, but this was for organizing a student demonstration against the government. The younger brother of a would-be regicide inciting students into insubordination. What would he have got for that in our day? He would certainly have been shot, and of the rest, they would have got some 25 and others 10 years, whereas he was merely expelled. Such cruelty. Yes, but he was also banished to Sakhalin, to the family estate of Kokoshkino, where he intended to spend the summer anyway. He wanted to work, so they gave him an opportunity to fell trees in the frozen north, to practice law in Samara, where he was simultaneously active in illegal political circles. After this, he was allowed to take his examinations at St. Petersburg University as an external student. With his curriculum vitae, what was the special section thinking of? Then, a few years later, this same young revolutionary was arrested for founding in the capital a League of Struggle for the Liberation of the Working Class, no less. He had repeatedly made seditious speeches to workers, had written political leaflets. Was he tortured, starved? No, they created for him conditions conducive to intellectual work. In the Petersburg investigation prison, where he was held for a year, and where he was allowed to receive the dozens of books he needed, he wrote the greater part of the development of capitalism in Russia, and moreover forwarded legally through the prosecutor's office his economic essays to the Marxist journal Novoyaslava. While in prison, he followed a prescribed diet, could have dinners sent in at his own expense, buy milk and buy mineral water from chemist's shop, and receive parcels from home 3 times a week. Trotsky, too, was able to put the first draft of his theory of permanent revolution on paper in the Peter and Paul fortress. But then, of course, he was condemned by a 3-man tribunal and shot. No, he wasn't even jailed, only banished. To Yakutia, then for life? No, to a land of plenty, Minsk. And for 3 years, he was taken there in handcuffs, in a prison train? Not at all. He traveled like a free man, went around Petersburg for 3 days without interference. Did the same in Moscow. He had to leave instructions for clandestine correspondence, establish connections, hold a conference of revolutionaries still at large. He was even allowed to go into exile at his own expense. That is, to travel with free passengers. Lenin never sampled a single convict train, or a single transit prison on his way out to Siberia, or, of course, on the return journey. Then, in Krasnoyarsk, 2 more months' work in the library saw the development of capitalism finished, and this book, written by a political exile, appeared in print without obstruction from the censorship. Measure that by our yardstick. But what would he live on in that remote village? Where would he obviously find no work? He asked for an allowance from the state, and they paid him more than he needed. It would have been impossible to create better conditions than Lenin enjoyed in his one and only period of banishment. A healthy diet at extremely low prices, plenty of meat, a sheep every week, milk, vegetables. He could hunt to his heart's content. When he was dissatisfied with his dog, friends seriously considered sending him one from Petersburg. When mosquitoes bit him while he was out hunting, he ordered kid gloves. He was cured of his gastric disorders and the other illnesses of his youth, and rapidly put on weight. He had no obligations, no work to do, nor duties, nor did his womenfolk exert themselves. For 2.5 rubles a month, a 15-year-old peasant girl did all the rough work about the house. Lenin had no need to write for money, turned down offers of paid work from Petersburg, and wrote only things which could bring him literary fame. He served his term of banishment. He could have escaped without difficulty, but was too circumspect for that. Was his sentence automatically extended, converted to deportation for life? How could it be? That would have been illegal. He was given permission to reside in Chekhov, on condition that he did not visit the capital. He did visit Riga and Smolensk. He was not under surveillance. Then he and his friend Marta took a basket of forbidden literature to the capital, traveling via Tsarskoye Selo, where there had been particularly strict controls. They had been too clever by half. He was picked up in Petersburg. True, he no longer had the basket, but he did have a letter to Plekhanov in invisible ink with the whole plan for launching Iskra. The police, though, could not put themselves to all that trouble. He was under arrest. And in a cell for 3 weeks. The letter was in their hands, and it remained undeciphered. What was the result of this unauthorized absence from Chekhov? 20 years hard labor, as it would have been in our time? No, just 3 weeks under arrest, and which he was freed from, after which he was freed completely to travel around Russia, setting up distribution centers for Iskra, then abroad to arrange publication. The police see no objection to granting him a passport for foreign travel. But this was the least of it. As an emigre, he would send home to Russia an article on Marx for the Granat Encyclopedia, and it would be printed, nor was it the only one. Finally, he carried on subversive activity from a little town in Austria and Poland near the Russian frontier, but no one sent undercover things to abduct him and bring him back alive, though it would have been the easiest thing in the world. Tsardom was always weak and irresolute in pursuit of its enemies. You could trace the same pattern back. You can trace the same pattern in the story of any important socialist democrat, Stalin in particular, though here suspicions of contributory factors insulates itself. Thus in 1904, Kamenev's room in Moscow was searched and compromising correspondence was seized. Under interrogation, he refused all explanation, and that was that. He was banished to his parents' place of residence. The socialist revolutionary, it is true, were persecuted more severely, but how severely? Would you say that Gershuni, arrested in 1903, had no serious crimes to answer for, or Savinkov, arrested in 1906. They organized the assassination of some of the highest-placed people in the empire, yet they were not executed. Then Maria Spiridonova was allowed to escape. She shot General Luzhenovsky, who put down the peasant rising in Tambov, shot him point blank, and once again they could not bring themselves to execute a terrorist and only sent her to forced labor. Just imagine what would have happened if a 17-year-old schoolgirl had shot the suppressor of the 1921 peasant rising, also in Tambov, and how many thousands of high school pupils and intellectuals would have been summarily shot without trial in the wave of retaliatory Red Terror. Were people shot for the naval mutiny at Sveaborg? No, just exiled. Ivanov Razumnik recalls how students were punished for the great demonstrations in Petersburg in 1901. The scene in the St. Petersburg prison was like a student picnic. Roars of laughter, community singing, students walking around freely from cell to cell. Ivanov Razumnik even had the impertinence to ask the prison governor to let him attend a performance by the touring company of the Moscow Art Theater, so as not to waste his ticket. Later, he was sentenced to banishment to Simferopol, which was his own choice, and he hiked all over Crimea with a rucksack. Adriana Tirkova writes about this period as follows: "We stuck to our principles, and the prison regime was not strict. Gendarme officers offered them meals from the best restaurant, Dodon's, according to the indefatigably curious Burtsev. The Petersburg prisons were much more humane than those of Western Europe. For calling on the Moscow workers to rise up in arms and overthrow the autocracy, Leonid Andreev was kept in his cell for a whole 15 days. He himself thought it was rather low and added 3 weeks on his own account." There are some entries in his diary at the time: "Solitary confinement. Never mind, it's not so bad. I make my bed, pull up my stool and my lamp, put some cigarettes and a pear nearby. I read, eat my pear, just like at home. I feel merry. That's the word, merry. Sir, excuse me, sir." The warder calls to him through the feeding hatch. Several books have arrived, and notes from neighboring cells. Summing it up, Andreev acknowledged that as far as board and lodging was concerned, he lived better in a cell than he had as a student. At this very time, Gorky was writing Children of the Sun in the Trubetskoy Bastion. The Bolshevik elite published a pretty shameless piece of self-advertisement in the shape of a volume 41 of the Granat Encyclopedia, Prominent Personalities of the USSR and the Great October Revolution, Autobiographies and Biographies. Read whichever of them you like. You will be astonished to find how lightly, by our standards, they got away with their revolutionary activity. And, in particular, what favorable conditions they enjoyed in prison. Take Krasин, for instance. He always remembered imprisonment in the Taganka with great pleasure. After the interrogation, the gendarme left him in peace. Why? And he devoted his involuntary leisure to unremitting toil. He learned German, read almost all the works of Schiller and Goethe in the original, acquainted himself with Schopenhauer and Kant, thoroughly studied Mill's logic and Wundt's psychology, and so on. For his place of exile, Krasin chose Irkutsk, the capital of Siberia and its most civilized town. This is Radek, in prison in Warsaw in 1906. He was in for half a year. of which he made splendid use, learning Russian, reading Lenin, Plekhanov, and Marx. While in prison, he wrote his first article on the trade union movement, was terribly proud when he received in jail the issue of Kautsky's journal containing his contributions. At the other extreme, Semashko's imprisonment, Moscow 1895, was unusually harsh. After 3 months in jail, he was exiled for 3 years to his native town, Yelets. The reputation of the terrible Russian Bastille was created in the West by people demoralized by imprisonment, like Parvis, who wrote his highly colored, bombastic, sentimental reminiscences to avenge himself on Tsarism. The same pattern can be traced in the experiences of lesser personalities in thousands of individual life stories. I have on hand an encyclopedia, not the most obviously relevant, since it is a literary encyclopedia, and an old edition at that, 1932, complete with errors. Before someone eradicates these errors, I will take the letter K at random. Karpenko Kerry, while secretary to the city police in Yelisavetgrad, provided passports for revolutionaries. Translating, as we go into our own language, an official in the passport section was supplied an underground organization with passports. Was he hanged for it? No, banished for 5 years to his own farm, in other words, to his country home. He became a writer. Kirillov V.T. took part in the revolutionary movement of the Black Sea sailors. Shot? Hard labor for life? No. 3 years banishment to Ust-Siltovsk, became a writer. Katsatkin I.M., while in prison, wrote stories which were published in newspapers. In our time, even ex-prisoners cannot get published. Karpov Yevitsky, after 2 periods of banishment, was put in charge of the Imperial Alexandrinsky Theater and the Suvorin Theater. In our time, he would have never obtained permission to reside in the capital, and in any case, the special section would not have taken him as a prompter, not have taken him on as a prompter. Khrushchevsky returned from banishment when the Stolypin reaction was at its wildest, and while remaining a member of the underground Bolshevik Central Committee, took up his profession as an engineer without hindrance. In our time, he would have been lucky to find a job as a mechanic in a machine tractor station. Although Krylenko hasn't gone into the literary encyclopedia, it seems only right to mention him along with the case. In all the years as a revolutionary hothead, he 3 times successfully avoided arrest and was 6 times arrested, but spent in all only 14 months in prison. In 1907, that year of reaction again, he was accused of agitation among the troops and participation in a military organization, and acquitted by the military district court. In 1915, for evading military service, he was an officer, and there was a war on. This future commander-in-chief and murderer of his predecessor in that post was punished by being sent to a front line, but not a punitive unit. It was how the Tsar's government proposed to damp down the fires of revolution while simultaneously defeating the Germans, and for 15 years it was under the shadow of his unclipped procuratorial wing that the endless lines of those condemned in countless trials shuffled through the courts and received their bullet in the back of the head. During the Stolypin reaction again, V.A. Staroselsky, governor of Kutaisi, who unhesitatingly supplied revolutionaries with passports and arms, and betrayed the plans of the police and the government forces to them, got away with something like 2 weeks imprisonment. Translate that into our language. If you have imagination enough, During the same reactionary phase, the Bolshevik philosophical and political journal, Misl, was legally published. And reactionary Vechty openly wrote about the obsolete autocracy, the evils of despotism and slavery. Fine, keep it up, we don't mind a bit. The severity of those times was beyond human endurance. Yanovsky, an art photographer in Yalta, made a sketch showing the shooter of the Chekhov sailors and exhibited it in his shop window, much as if someone nowadays had exhibited episodes from the punitive operation at Novocherkassk in a window of the Kuznetsky Most. And what did the Yalta police chief do? Because Livadia was so near, he behaved with particular cruelty. He began shouting at Yanovsky, and he went on to destroy not Yanovsky's studio, oh dear no, not the sketch of the shooting, but a copy of the sketch. Some will explain this by Yanovsky's sleight of hand, but let us note that the governor did not order the window to be broken in his presence. Thirdly, a very heavy penalty was inflicted on Yanovsky himself. As long as he continued to reside in Yalta, he must not appear in the street while the imperial family was passing through. Burtsev, in an emigre journal, went so far as to cast aspersions on the private life of the Tsar when he returned to the motherland on the flood tide of patriotism in 1914. Was he shot? He spent less than a year in prison with permission to receive books and to carry on his literary pursuits. No one stayed the axeman's hand, and in the end, the tree would fall. Thanks for listening. Have a good one.